why.
Okay, I see Ted in YouTube. Let me go live, and I think we're ready. Let me tell you when it's live.
Oh, so that really did it?
Well, I'm going to check.
I can see it. It says here on my screen, live
Okay.
on custom live streaming service.
All right.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
All right. So I'm gonna start. Oh no, now.
I can see it. It says here on my.
I know. The problem is that I am.
Now you can start the recording
I
again.
just got to turn off the. I'm seeing two different versions. I know. The problem is that I am. Okay, if I mute
YouTube, Ted.
You turn off YouTube because you've got the delay of YouTube in there.
I know. I just want to make sure I don't stop everything when I do that. If I just close
YouTube
that
is the client. YouTube is the end of the stream.
Okay, so everything's working still. I didn't screw it up by closing that thing. Okay.
All right. Very good.
It's now 7:30, and I'm going to go admit these 19 people unless somebody else wants to.
I will be happy to admit people.
Okay, Nancy, could you admit people while I start the meeting?
I don't see anybody to admit it. See, everybody's in.
Allow.
Let me see the chat.
Oh, they're all in? Okay.
I believe so. Jaime, are you in? I saw you on there.
All right. In which case, I guess for now, Nancy and
Wait
Smith,
1 second. Let's make sure.
I just want you to listen.
Yeah, they're all in.
Okay. I'd like you to blank your screen until after until we're in the question period or.
No. That's right. All of us, Steve, Smith, and I think you can talk. You can say.
So I'm about to start speaking. Okay. And I'm going to turn on recording. Okay. And now I want to, okay, we have about 20 people here. And this is the beginning. Hello, everybody. Sorry for the chit chat before the meeting. I want to welcome you to BayChi. BayChi is a affiliation of the Association for Computing Machineries, SIGCHI. SIGCHI is the biggest and best conference in computer interface. For those of you that haven't gone to it, it's quite a thing with thousands of people and hundreds of sessions. There's still this year a late breaking news paper that solicitation that you can you'll be able to make in January. With respect to us, we've been around since 1989, having programs pretty much weekly. Monthly on the second Tuesday of the month, typically, and usually at Xerox PARC, although we haven't done that in a long while. We've been doing it on this Zoom. And we enjoy everybody coming, and we'll be having questions. You can put them on the chat or or wait till the end, raise your hand if you need to. We'll be going for about an hour, and then we'll have more questions. Before the meetings, we often have a chance to meet the speaker or to talk about yourselves and your work in Chi in something we call dinners, and you'll notice that. We always are interested in people, new people. Please put up your hands if you're a new person. We're interested in how many people are new to the BayChi experience each time. To be a BayChi experience creator, all you have to do is be somebody that wants to help, and we have lots of things you can do. Right now, Edwin Lee, for example, is starting a Birds of a Feather on careers and in computer-human interface. And we have a steering committee that meets once a month, the first Tuesday of the month. You can come to that if you'd like and talk about how we run things. It's probably more interesting for people that are involved with making things happen. We want to celebrate tonight a very special thing that just happened, which is Steve Williams spearpointed and did most of the work of transferring our whole web experience off of one platform onto another. I'd been there for, whatever, dozens of years. So the fact that we still exist online is only because he did it before the deadline of the old service dying tomorrow. And so very grateful to that. And it's a very special day in that regard. But it's a special day in another regard. And that regard is that we have Mark Whitting here. he is actually in Korea, of all things. He's in the last day of his quarantine because it takes a while to get into a new country these days. And he's there on family matters. But Mark has a very interesting career. He started off in getting a graduate degree in mechanical engineering, but realizing that in fact, organizing and working together as a team is completely critical to any of the work that he did as when he was learning to be an industrial designer or mechanical engineering PhD, and in fact has done a lot of work at Stanford, and now he's at the Wharton School of Management, I believe, as a postdoc again. And tonight he's going to really give us some insights into something that I was completely intrigued by when I started talking to the team over at Stanford around the persona and how you work in teams. But I really want Mark to give us a little bit more of the introduction. And Mark, you if you can unmute yourself and put up your slides, we are delighted to let you take it away.
Hi there. Thank you so much for the introduction, Ted. And yeah, I'm just making sure that my slides are sharing. Does that look okay on your end? Okay, great.
It looks beautiful.
Yes. So thanks for the introduction. And yes, I'm currently a postdoc with Duncan Watts at UPenn, sort of moving into this context where we think a lot about computational social science more broadly. And my academic path has been sort of complicated in that I have studied a lot of HCI and a lot of decision making with computer systems, sort of with an ultimate goal of understanding how we can help people make decisions better at very large scale, perhaps on the level of teams, but perhaps on the level of societies. And so the work that I'll talk about today is mostly focused on teams and how to get teams to be more sustainable and more long-lived. And so I'm happy to dive into that now if there's nothing else, and I'll get started. I'm taking the silence as let's
go for it, Mark. We want to.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So the tonight's talk is entitled "Resetting Remote Team Dynamics," and this will all be about how identity plays a role in who we are within teams, and how we can actually mediate that role by doing some interesting online interventions. And this is work with a bunch of really great undergrad students. Some of them are currently on the job market, trying to get into big businesses. And some others are now applying for PhDs. If you're interested in hiring any kind of people like this, I can provide strong recommendations to many of these people. So reach out if that's the case. And then also this is work with Melissa Valentine and Michael Bernstein, my advisor at Stanford at the time. Okay, so diving in. Well, it's the case that often teams end up being in a situation where they're pretty unhappy with the collaborations that they're going through. And we can think of these as sort of troubled teams, right? They start off interacting peacefully, but over time things devolve and they kind of get annoyed at each other. And we often wonder, is it the case that we could sort of rewind history and like in an alternate reality, could we rewind history and perhaps get a different outcome? And another way of thinking about this is the fracture, this sort of breaking of the team, inevitable based on who is on the team, right? Is it these people that are causing the problem? And when we look back on these situations, it often seems inevitable, right? We sort of explain it away as saying, oh, the people on that team were at fault, right? Like this particular collaborator was just not a very nice person and they made us a team that wanted to stop working together. Or alternatively, we think about this situation where it's outside of the control of any one individual and we say, oh, this team was under too much pressure, or the project that this team was working on was poorly managed from above. And as a consequence, we never sort of agreed to do the things that we wanted to do and we fell apart over time. Okay, and throughout this talk, I'm going to use this word fracture, where I'm sort of thinking about viability of a team dipping so low that the team essentially would decide to break apart. And just for context, viability is this term that describes a team's sort of willingness and goals around continuing to collaborate. And this is sort of widely used in the social psychological communities and in team behavior and some related communities. Now, as it turns out, we often don't talk about viability with the same fortitude that we talk about team performance. And so I'm not going to focus on team performance too much this evening. I will incorporate it just to check that the things that I'm showing aren't impacting performance too much. But this is primarily around the goal of thinking about how do we make teams that are sustainable. And as it turns out, viability, some of the key antecedents of viability are things like people's willingness to engage and trust one another. And similarly, viability ends up being a key antecedent of team performance. Okay, so one other aspect of this is that in today's world, we're sort of increasingly vulnerable to this situation, where we have more and more remote teams, where we often don't get a chance to have the full level of dynamics that we would like. We have sort of these distance effects, as Olson have described. But there's other factors here, right? Often if something does go wrong, it gets it sort of amplifies and becomes worse faster than it might if we were in an in-person context and could talk through issues. And we can see this broadly at several levels, right? We see this on Twitter, where people's interactions are very polarizing. And instead of having meaningful conversations, we get in situations where people are sort of yelling at each other and then being very annoyed and upset. And so the sort of tenet of the first part of this talk is going to be to ask, who is to blame in a situation like this? Now, to do this ideally, we would actually need to be able to reset memories. For example, if we could rewind a troubled team and then let them play again, we would be able to sort of understand if they had the same outcomes, right? Or is that team always going to have that outcome? And as it happens, we can't do this very easily. So we need some way to get the same teams to collaborate in a repeated fashion without really knowing that that's what's happening. And the reason, sort of underlying this is that if we compare different teams, which many traditional studies in this field have done, we actually get a confounding of the sort of person effects, like one person is responsible for this outcome, and the situational effects. That is to say, like, the management hierarchy or something external to the team is the cause. And similarly, if we just sort of ignored this and let teams interact repeatedly, we would see that these early interactions actually change the collective memory, the sort of transactive memory where people have some shared process memory as a team, and that would cascade through time, ending up meaning that you don't actually get a sort of clean measure. Okay, so I'm going to propose an experimental method that I'm going to try to convince you allows us to resolve these challenges. And this method involves reconvening teams repeatedly without them realizing that that's what's happening, and then measuring behavioral consistency across multiple team interactions. So sort of one way of thinking about this is that our unit of analysis is a team, and this idea of resetting teams, I'll talk about in a moment. So the way this looks is we have online teams, and they have some group interaction. So we put a team in a room together, and they start interacting. And then in the next cycle, so we sort of have rounds of teams interacting. In the next cycle, they're paired with new people. And here, each blue member would have gone off into other teams, and we're tracking one particular blue member, and you can see that members from other teams are now there with them. So everybody is new, as it were. And then we sort of move into another round. This would be the third round, where we reconvene the same team that we had before. So all the blue members come back and start talking again. And here, however, we mask their identities. So they may not know that they're working with the same people they had worked before. So it's in effect a sort of same team. And then we ask this higher level question, are these same teams actually consistent? So the first time they fell apart, at the end of their collaboration, they said, no, we don't want to work together again. Would that happen again the second time? That's sort of the core measure and the core question that we're reaching at here. Now, how does this actually work? How does this masking work? So in the first round, each member would see their own identity, which would be something like conventional horse or fast frog. These are two names of two members on this team. And then they also have this sort of group identity, the identity, how the rest of the group knows them. Okay, so conventional horse is known as Mighty Pony. These are the pseudonyms we're providing them, but they don't actually know that that's a pseudonym being used for them. And as they start to collaborate, we automatically, behind the scenes, convert names appropriately, so each member of the chat room sees the appropriate name for themselves. Okay, and then we do this sort of every round. And so this is round B, where they've come back to start working together again. And the key thing here is that this masking is two-way. So what the masking on one side is sort of reflected on the other side. So everybody individually thinks that their own identities are consistent over time. And so they think they're always being presented as conventional horse, but everyone else sees them as a new identity end to end. Okay, and you'll see here that conventional horse is now seen as friendly mule, as opposed to their previous pseudonym of Mighty Pony. Okay, and we also do a lot of careful things to make sure that people in these interactions don't realize this is happening. For example, when people mention others in the chat room they're currently in, we provide them with a list of the people that we're saying are there, and this, of course, is their pseudonyms, not their actual name. And then we also do some things to autocomplete. So if somebody accidentally types something incorrectly, we might not be able to convert that to the correct username. So we force autocompletions where necessary. Okay, now stepping back into this idea of a study design that uses this concept, I'm just going to talk about the kinds of conditions that we compare. So here I'm talking about masked and unmasked conditions. I'm zooming out to show all of the people in all of these teams. So in this masked first convening, we see that each team is just the same group of people, for example, like the all blue team that I showed earlier. And then we have these mixed rounds where we mix people between these team buckets. And then we have the reconvening rounds. And as I said earlier, we're going to compare the first convening and the reconvenings, and those will be our measurement units. One of the really important things here is that we are sure that people don't realize this modification is occurring. Okay, so after people complete these experiments, we ask them if they could identify the pair of teams that consisted with the same people. We say, one of these sets of teams was actually the same people as another. Can you identify that pair? And we essentially remove teams who answer this accurately above a certain rate. Of course, there's a chance level that they guess randomly correctly, and we remove teams who get substantially above chance. Okay, so now just digging into how this works. Yeah, by the way, in this design, the random chance is 1/6. Okay, so digging into how we run this experiment, our setup is that we have these chat-based interactions. In this case, we did it with 140 teams. We're doing this with workers recruited from Amazon Mechanical Turk, and they do 4 rounds of a 10-minute task. So basically they have a 40-minute thing with little surveys in between that we use as measurements. And as I've mentioned before, we're doing this consistency check between rounds where it's the same people, whether or not they're masked, and those are our 2 conditions. Okay, and we also explore this across several task types. Okay, so our creative task is an ad writing task where people write an advertisement for a Kickstarter product. And this is a very useful task because it actually is similar to tasks that people do on platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk. And it's a task that we can measure performance on a real ad network. So we can take the ads that people write, we can run them on an ad network, and we can see how well they perform. Next is the intellective task. And this is an estimation task, which again, we can check performance of exactly because we can see how accurately the team reached the correct estimation of a particular factor. And then it is a cognitive conflict task. And the way we do cognitive conflict is by getting people to negotiate as a group about how to allocate some funds to a variety of different value-oriented endeavors. So one might be supporting veterans, another might be supporting students, and another might be supporting a different kind of social community. These are all tasks drawn from the literature, and these titles of kinds of tasks are drawn from McGrath's task circumplex, which is a descriptive mechanism for talking about the relationships between tasks. I'm not going to get into too much detail about that because I think that's sort of not it doesn't influence our findings that much, but I'm happy to talk more about our task selection and so forth. Okay, and as I said before, our main measure is this idea of fracture. So it's sort of whether or not you'd want to keep working with this team. And the way we measure this is we basically tell people there's a chance that they'll work with one of their previous teams, and they can remove those teams from the potential to work with them again. Okay. We also check viability through a standard viability score survey, which allows us to compare this to fracture. We'll talk about that comparison later. And then the idea that we really care about is whether or not there's consistency between these two things. So that's sort of our key measure. And of course, we have this manipulation check that I talked about. So before we dive in, I'll just sort of calm the critical audience member who might think the manipulation is failing. It turns out that it works pretty well. People have very little idea that this is going on. And any time where we see indications that they do realize that it's going on, we remove those teams from our analysis, just to make sure that the analysis that we do is as honest as possible to the actual ongoing effects. Okay, so the question that we're really able to ask with this is sort of how consistent is this idea of team fracture? On the one hand, if team members cause fracture, we would expect it to be quite consistent. And on the other hand, if the interaction situation causes fracture, we would expect it to be inconsistent because the situation is reset, but the team members are not reset. And this unmasked condition that I've talked about, this one where they know that they're working with the same people that they worked with before, that's going to be our baseline consistency. So it's sort of like a quasi-control. Okay, and from a hypothesis standpoint, this is the one that we stood behind. Our sort of assumption before starting this experiment was that, in fact, most teams that fall apart do so because of an inconsistency. Do so because of situational factors, and this will lead to inconsistency. Okay, let's look at the data. So,
Mark,
what I'm
can
going
I
to
interrupt you?
Yeah, go ahead. Sure
We've
thing.
got a question from Paul Sass, and Paul, I think I've given you permission to talk.
Oh, sure. Very cool method, but when you said that it was unusual, what was the fraction of people who indicated in the manipulation check that they thought they might be with the same teams?
Yeah. So what you'd expect is that if people don't know the right answer, they guess with about random chance, because we give them a few options, and you'd expect that if they don't know, they're just going to guess something. We force them to guess something, and you'd expect it to be close to random chance. So over the sort of span of teams that we did, hundreds of teams, including many more hundreds in piloting, the vast majority were at random, and a very small number would have a behavioral signal. For example, somebody wrote in a very particular way, and somebody else would say, "Wait a minute, I think you're the same person that
Right.
you were last time," and we could see this in the chat interactions, and we just removed those teams. Basically, if there was no substantial behavioral signal, no team was substantially different from chance. So a vast majority were right at chance. And I don't remember the exact number across all the data because we've done many different analyses, but yeah, that's broadly the way that happened.
Yeah, it does seem exactly that if somebody was using some kind of distinctive gestures or
Exactly.
expression, then
Yeah.
they might be recognizable.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's dig into this result. So I'm going to talk about comparing these masked and unmasked teams, and I'm going to talk about this idea of consistency of fracture. So this is whether or not it happened both in the first and second time, or didn't happen both in the first and second time that they interact. And I'm going to talk about these 3 different task types. Okay, so let's start with creative tasks, right? Creative task, this ad writing task, is what I would call substantially inconsistent across these two scenarios, where being masked, that is not knowing that you're working with the same people, made it about chance that you would have the same outcome that you had before. What this suggests is that this is really about the situational factors. Now, interestingly, we see a rather different result with the other 2 task types. And we see something that's much closer to knowing with whom you're collaborating. This is quite intriguing, right? It sort of indicates that this fracture consistency idea is actually quite polarizing around the different task types that we might see. And this sort of makes some intuitive sense, right? Different kinds of tasks require us to be somewhat different people. In fact, we present ourselves differently. We may even think through the way we collaborate quite differently. And in the context of a creative task, you have situations where people might be offended that their design or their suggestion wasn't included. Whereas in the context of these other 2 task types, that may play a different role. Okay, so let's take that and sort of check that there's not other things that might be influencing it. So the first thing to consider is, as was asked, are people aware of this manipulation? We find that they're not for the vast majority of cases. And is this notion of fracture well connected to these known constructs? For example, viability, and yes, it predicts it with quite a good strength. And here is that across all the task types that we saw. And we see a very, very similar signal across these task types in terms of viability and fracture being correlated. Another question that you might wonder is this idea of baseline fracture sort of similar across rounds? Basically, do people get tired of collaborating and start, being, more likely to fracture? And we do not find that that's the case. Another question you might wonder is, do individuals predict fracture, right? Are there bad eggs who make some of these teams much more likely to fail? And we find that this is partially true, but it turns out that it's only true in extremes, right? There's some people who are sort of extremely predictive, but the vast majority of people have no contribution to this predictive outcome. And this is a very sort of interesting point that we could dig into, and happy to talk about that more later. Then another question that you might wonder is, how does this seem to relate to performance? I said earlier that viability or perhaps fracture is an antecedent to performance, and we find that actually there's not a whole lot of signal here. The inconsistent or consistent pairs of teams tended to perform roughly similarly. Now, I will just mention that, as I said earlier, we can only check performance on the creative and the intellective tasks. The cognitive conflict style task is sort of too subjective for us to have a good performance measure. But yeah. And then lastly, do chat patterns differ across conditions? So, is there some sort of major difference happening? And we checked a variety of different metrics here, and I'll talk more about example metrics in a little bit, but we don't see that there's a substantial effect here. Okay, so sort of what I'm coming to show is that there's some underlying difference that might be really meaningful about teams' repeated interactions. And here's just an interesting example where here's the same team convened with different, different pseudonyms to themselves. We have gone ahead and made sure that you see the same pseudonyms, but individually they would have seen themselves as masked, just so that you can compare who's saying what. And you see some interesting things. So in the first case here, they sort of seem relatively pleasant to each other, and they work through the task and they talk through some suggestions. In the second one, there's a little bit more confusion. And the same team ended up fracturing. And so I just want to show this as a sort of an example that these people who have largely the same context to contribute to a team end up behaving quite differently through the sort of time context of their experience. And this is reflected very, very clearly in their votes about whether or not to fracture. Okay. So I sort of argue here that it could have ended another way, right? We can see that some of these tasks, in particular the creative tasks that we studied, is heavily path dependent. We suspect that there's probably other task types, if we explored the entire range of tasks that people do, that we would see this kind of differing pattern on. We also sort of argue that this methodology is widely applicable, right? Like we could imagine studying various other kinds of phenomenon. And I'm going to talk about some examples of that in a few minutes.
So maybe is
Okay.
a good time to interrupt with a question?
Absolutely, yeah.
So Patricia asks, were there any incentives offered for successful teamwork?
Yes. So the way we incentivized teams in this case is we said you'll receive bonus payment based on the performance of the task that you conduct. So something like the ad task, they would receive a small bonus if their ad was more performant than other ads written by other people. This is not an incentive to remain collaborative. So we're not saying that you sort of have the requirement of being friends, but it is related to the kinds of performance incentives that we see in the real world. And critically, when we ask this question of people sort of forecasting their future collaborations, what we're really getting at is people's judgment of whether or not they think they'll be able to succeed in a collaboration with those people. And so we think that sort of operationalizes the incentive to indicate something about their willingness to collaborate.
Thank you. Is
Sure.
that satisfying, Patricia? I assume she'll object, and we can come back to it if there's more.
Absolutely.
More to
Yeah,
go.
yeah, absolutely.
Let's keep
No,
moving.
she says yes. That's fine. Okay.
Okay, great. Okay, great. All right, I'll keep moving forward.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've sort of shown this tool as maybe a theoretical exploration. Might it be possible for us to apply this in a real work context? And sort of, if we were going to do so, would it work? Would we be able to do something useful for companies or for other kinds of online teams? And so the way we're going to talk about this is to sort of ask if a team would be more viable if it could undo its initial interaction steps and essentially try again. Like, could we sort of build a context where people could choosably forget their backgrounds or their team histories? The way that I'm going to dive into this is by introducing a slightly different experimental design and then operationalizing it through two different questions. So the nature of this design, differing from the previous one, is that we no longer switch people between teams. We just reset identities. So they have identities reset 3 times in a row or some number of times in a row. And we're doing the same thing to mask their identities between rounds. So they have these pseudonyms and so on. All of those aspects are the same. And critically here, the manipulation check changes a little bit because now they're actually all the same people. So if they answered any pair of teams, they'd be right. So now we get people to match specific names on an individual level. You could definitely argue that this is a little bit looser, a little bit tighter of a requirement. Like, it's a little bit harder to do. And so we're a little bit stricter about the response. So in this case, any team that gets it right on more than one participant is removed from our analysis. And we just treat it that way. Okay, and in the first study that I'm going to talk about with this, we're going to ask this question of, will the most viable team improve or regress to the mean over time? So in this case, we're having several repeated new identities with all the same people, and one of them is a reconvened version of an earlier team. And the way we choose which one is reconvened is by identifying the highest viability version of this group in the first 3 rounds of their collaborations. So we have these 3 parallel, sort of so-called parallel rounds where they're each entering into a new universe. And then we have this reconvened version that reproduces the highest viability version from those 3 parallel rounds. And then we have one more new identity round, and that's just to make sure that our randomization is strong. So we can always like flip-flop everything. We can check if there's order effects and other stuff like this. Okay. And the critical thing that we're measuring, again, is viability. Just sort of being explicit here, we're no longer asking people if they would be willing to collaborate with the previous team. Again, we're just using this standard viability scale that's a well-published mechanism for checking the viability of a team. And participants perform that same scale after every single interaction that they have. So every one of these rounds, they then go and complete this 14-item viability scale, as well as some other scales that we care about. Okay, and here I'm going to talk about the best initial round. So out of the first 3, which one was best and what was its viability? And then the reconvene round, so that's which one we chose to reconvene. And then we'll compare these to the median of all the other rounds, right? So it's sort of like, how do they do on average, essentially? What we're reporting here is the team mean viability, so it's mean across all the participants. The reason this is on a 10 to 70 scale is because of the nature of viability. It's measured, on this particular survey instrument that happens to have that range. Okay, so what we see here is that these high viability teams, that is the team that did best the first time around, retains the viability they got. They actually increase a little bit on average, and that compared with these the median round, they're significantly different, right? So basically, you see that the value of having a good start is maintained through a repeated collaboration. That is to say that the same people starting off on a good foot is much more likely to be successful in the long run than starting off on, say, the wrong foot. At least that's what we're showing here. As I mentioned before, we're just removing people who realize that this manipulation was happening, even at the most minor level. So we're very certain that people don't know the manipulation is happening. And the task that all of these later experiments are being run on is that add writing task that I mentioned, because it has a lot of robust properties that we like. Okay. Now, in the second study of this same sort of question, we ask, does the least viable team also improve over time, right? Is there a learning effect on viability that that might be, a way to avoid this mattering? And critically, does it ever beat the most viable one, right? Do they ever do better than they might have done had we reconvened a different team? And so the way we run this is we calculate which team had the highest viability and which team had the lowest viability, and then we reconvene those at the end. And we do both. And of course, again, we're doing all the kinds of flip-flopping and randomization that you would want to make sure that order and other factors like that aren't playing a role in the result that we see. And so here, I'm going to talk about the initial highest and then the later highest, and then pair that with the initial lowest and the later lowest team viabilities. Okay, and we're seeing that there is an improvement on the highest, similar to what we saw before. And there's also an improvement on the lowest. The lowest actually do sort of quite a bit better than they did before. However, importantly, the highest remains significantly different from the lowest, no matter, despite that trajectory. And they never get beat out, right? The lowest gets better, but it never manages to outperform the highest in this design. And again, the sort of same details about excluding manipulation, people who don't pass the manipulation, and so forth. Okay, so what we're sort of getting a sense of here is that. Oh, sorry. Let me just respond to any potential other sources of error that we might consider. And a few things that we checked is whether discourse patterns had an influence on these results. So that's basically saying like the teams who talk, have more shared more shared discussion, or have higher or lower sentiment, or better turn taking. Do they seem to have a significant effect on the viabilities measured between these teams? We don't see any substantial signals there. And then similarly, we did the same sort of question with regard to performance, where this now represents all performance of all teams in a percentile rating. As you may be familiar, ad performance with this kind of task is quite broad. Some ads do way better than other ads, and so we treat this as a percentile rank. And critically here, we're just talking about correlation with viability. We're not talking about correlation with any other underlying phenomenon, and so that ends up being important when we think about what we're predicting with these outcomes. Okay. So we can see that we might be able to make teams end sort of on their best foot. With this parallel worlds intervention, we can get these teams to restart, and potentially we can choose which version of the team that we want to run. In a broader setting, we could imagine doing this as kind of an analytic method to help choose the version of a team that you'd most likely to reinforce in repeated interactions. And we see that it improves over time. And other researchers have found this too with other kinds of viability analysis. But critically, we don't find that it improves so much that it outperforms the initial strong viability teams. Now, you might imagine that it could continue going up forever. Of course, this viability scale is capped, so we don't expect that to happen. And in all our analysis about across time team viabilities, we get nothing better than the signals that we provided here. But that's definitely something to look into if we wanted to run this long-term or in other kinds of teams. And the way that we could imagine remote teams sort of incorporating this kind of idea is as something like a norming or team forming experience, where they're told, you're going to do this experience where you're going to be paired with people repeatedly, and of course be debriefed, as we debriefed all our participants about how this happened. But the sort of interesting thing here is that you could reach a level where with the same team members, you start getting much more sort of happiness within the groups about how they're collaborating and about the potential for them to continue working for long periods in sort of longitudinal collaborations. It is critical to mention here that all of our analysis is on relatively short-lived teams. Now, that of course introduces some complexities, and we can't really say that longer-lived teams are going to see exactly the same effects. But we can say that in today's world, these short-lived teams are more and more frequent. We do a lot of work with crowds and other kinds of gig works or gig platforms. And there's all kinds of collaborations or interactions that are incredibly short-lived, but are incredibly important to the success of the product or to the success of the user experience. An example of this is something like an Uber driver, where if the interaction between an Uber driver and their passenger is going sour, that may be a great predictor of whether or not that interaction should occur again, and you might purposefully avoid that driver and that passenger being paired in the future. Of course, many other kinds of interactions, especially in gig teams, which is an increasingly common sort of tool used by various kinds of organizations, could be focused on. Lastly, on this point, the infrastructure that we've run all these experiments with is available. It's open source, and I'm absolutely happy to share that with people who want to run experiments on it. We have a few people running other kinds of experiments on it now, but yeah, if that's something of interest, please contact me. Okay, so this is probably another time for questions, if there's any right at this point, before I dive into the next segment.
This is Ted Selker, and this last point was just a fascinating one, which is, certainly cashiers and, you're collaborating to, post office, whatever, trying to get a ski lift ticket, whatever. All of those are, I don't think of them as much as collaborations as transactions. And I guess I'm just wondering if you can also at some point, maybe also later on in this, relate to collaborations where people depend on and build relationships, which is most of what we do in a work setting, obviously. And maybe that isn't what you're talking about. That's fine. I'm just
So I'm
maybe
afraid
Mark,
it's
I'm
not
sorry,
much
can you
of what I'm
maybe
talking about.
summarize the question, because the captioning wasn't getting it.
Absolutely. So the
Thank you.
question was, is there, many of the examples that I provided are short-lived interactions that may be more transactive than true collaborations. And many of the things that we think of as true collaborations are longer-lived and have other dynamics. For example, you get to meet people's family, and that might change the way you think about who they are. And I don't have a good way to incorporate claims about that latter group of collaborations at this time. I can say that in a variety of circumstances where we've used this to study other phenomenon, we see very similar results to longer-lived versions of the same experiments. So we see that behavior appears to be predicting the same kinds of interactions that you see at larger scales, but we haven't run experiments outside of the scale that I've talked about so far. Okay.
It's really
I'm going to.
I don't see it. I see them as a different. It's a different situation. And that's all.
Yes. Yeah. It's absolutely a different kind of collaboration, a different kind of interaction, and one that we're probably more familiar with, these longer term interactions. However, I feel that increasingly we have very sort of transitive interactions that maybe this for which this may be more informative. But okay, so I'm going to move on to the next section, where we start to think about whether or not we might be able to predict these outcomes. So, essentially, we have this data. Could we then sort of use this to spot toxicity in teams before it really surfaces? And so this may speak to this issue of how things happen in longer time periods, and it'll be interesting to see what you think. So here we're going to use a classification model, very, very simple machine learning approach here. So we have all these chat logs, about 700 chat logs, with this viability ground truth, right? We've measured viability across all these chat logs. And we're going to do binary classification, just checking if they're sort of high or low viability teams. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that classification means in a moment. And then we're going to report the results of a logistic regression. This is convenient for a variety of reasons. One is that we can actually see how the factors play a role in the outcome. Another is that it was sort of as accurate or more accurate than many other techniques that we tried. So we felt that it was totally suitable. It's also incredibly fast to train and evaluate. So on the right here, you can see that the spread of viability scores sort of gives you a sense of how these scores are panning out across this data set. And a critical thing here is that we need this set of features. And sort of as slight background, most viability related concerns in current businesses today, like if you ask a boss to tell us the viability of their team, it's entirely subjective, or we measure it by an instrument after the fact, right? The team collaborates and then we measure it and we say, oh, how did this team do? And essentially right now we have this instrument data, that's our ground truth for all the data we have. So to look at the interaction features, we're taking two approaches. On the one hand, we take computationally derived features, and these are things that we can basically just read the text chat and derive patterns of various kinds that we think might be interesting. And these are things like work patterns, which might be like how people are taking turns or what the discourse markers are, and linguistic patterns. And these are things like loop categories, where we have some literature about team viability that might suggest certain kinds of words or certain kinds of sentiment are more likely to be predictive of specific outcomes. And then we also have this group of features that we call human labeled features. And this is where we've got Amazon Mechanical Turk workers to go through and read the chats for each of these interactions, and then code through another survey instrument, code each of these chats as having a variety of features. And these, again, are sort of theory driven, right? They're from the existing literature on what might predict team viability. Things like the presence of sarcasm, how playful the team is behaving, but things also like how frustrated team members might be, or whether or not there seems to be social loafing. So these are our two groups of features. We're going to treat them as one group and just sort of do all the features, but it will be interesting. We'll sort of also dig into how they perform individually. Okay, so starting off, I mentioned that we're going to try to classify high and low team viability, and then we're going to report sort of how well we do at that task. And here on the x-axis, I'm showing the % viability split. So if it was 50-50, that would be basically splitting at the median. So the high would be everybody above the median, and the low would be everybody below the median. And then something like a 90 split is splitting at the top decile. So everybody above, everyone that we consider high there is above the 90th percentile of team viability, and everyone below is the rest of the population, and that's considered low. And here you can see that we're reporting the AUC, and that we get actually quite powerful accuracy on many of these, especially as viability increases, right? So in these higher viability teams, we're more able to distinguish what's going on. Now, you'll notice here also that I'm distinguishing between computationally derived and human labeled features. And we see that actually the combination of those two does about as good as just the computationally derived features. And then the human features do worse overall, and tend to be less predictive in general. Now, this is sort of interesting. It gives us a few opportunities. One critical one being that the human labeling takes a lot of time and can't be done in real time, right? Basically, it can only be done after the fact. We can only say, like, here's a team chat, now tell us whether or not it has these particular features. Whereas on the other hand, these computationally derived features, they can mostly be calculated in real time. So if you give somebody just a few sentences of a chat, you might be able to see what's going on. And I'm just going to sort of dive into the features that I mentioned for a moment. As I just said, these computational features dominate. Here at the bottom, I'm depicting that computational features are going to be square and human labeled features are going to be round. And then features in blue are the ones that are significant predictors of some kind. And the ordering of these is essentially how predictive a given feature is. So features at the top are more useful predictors, and further down they're less useful predictors. And then I've categorized them across the three buckets that we're talking about. Now, just to zoom in so you can sort of get a better sense of what some of these features are like, our most powerful predictor, the thing that works across every level and is remarkably easy to calculate also, is the use of second person terms. So this is basically talking to other people and about other people in a friendly way. And there's many other things that sort of maybe aren't too surprising, but we think it's very interesting that we can see these coming out and how powerful each one is. An example that's quite interesting is that sarcasm is positively correlated with the most viable teams, but it's not such a useful indicator in the lower viability teams. So that's sort of to suggest that when teams are doing well, they do even better if they are a little bit sarcastic and playful. Okay, now the other thing that I started hinting at is that we could actually do this in real time if we used the the computationally derived features, right? If we processed the data, the chat as it's coming in with these computationally derived features, we could start to make guesses early on in an actual team interaction before the team interaction is done about how that team is going to do. And again, I'm talking about this across three splits. the 10%, so it's who's in the lowest decile, the median split, and then who's in the top decile. And on the x-axis here, we're showing the number of seconds into the interaction. Yep, go ahead.
That was such a fascinating list of attributes about people's conversation. Just an amazing list. And did you just sit down and think these through, or did you get this from somebody else's metric, or did you get it from your machine learning? This list is quite fascinating.
Yeah. So we derived basically every item on this list from existing literature about team dynamics and team viability, where some of these are considered parts of aggregate behavioral phenomena, so things like being nice to each other, and then parts of these are very specifically called out by that literature. And things like sarcasm are very interesting because the literature does suggest that at different levels, sarcasm will play different roles, right? In a team that's not doing well, sarcasm may be sort of negatively correlated with success, but in a team that's doing really well, it may be positively correlated. I don't show where all of those are coming from here, or whether or not we reinforce the hypotheses given by the existing literature, or perhaps the theory given by the existing literature. But in the paper, we do talk about that, and I'm happy to link to that paper or to share that paper after the talk. But we talk about where all these features come from and sort of why we chose them.
Fascinating side story. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So the thing that I really want to sort of show here is that being able to tell if a team is a top performing, in the top 10%, within the first 70 seconds of an interaction. And again, this is all in the same data set, so it's all these 10-minute interactions. But in the first 70 seconds, we can already tell how well this team is going to do with about 90% accuracy. So we're getting like 90% of the predictive power that we have when we have the entire data set. And this, to us, is just incredibly powerful, right? Like, this basically means that you can tell if a team is going to do well really quickly, and if they're having a hard time, even in the first few minutes, you can perhaps introduce some kind of resetting intervention, like the one that I just talked about earlier in the talk. This is sort of in line with some of what we see in the thin slicing literature. For example, marriage success prediction, or some other people have studied like team performance in design teams at Stanford. And they've seen sort of similar things, but they haven't been able to do it computationally. So doing this computationally means that we can do it in real time as teams are interacting, and then perhaps nudge them depending on what we find. Okay, so we think of this as sort of staying off the wrong foot, right? We don't want people to blame each other or necessarily the system. Instead, we want them to think about how low viability is often path dependent, and that we should think about ways to reset it. And we see the parallel worlds intervention as potentially a way to do that, right? Potentially a way to introduce teams or construct teams that lets us make sure that they're going to work out. And if it's not working out early, in the first 10 minutes, like we're talking about, then you might be able to reset them and help them get to a better start. And then thirdly, being able to predict viability lets us decide when to harness an intervention like this, or use some of the other recommendations from the literature. And just to think about what some of those are like, there's things like getting a manager to step in and say, like, maybe we need to set some norms here, or perhaps introducing a procedural mechanism to make sure things go okay. And I will just say, this prediction tool that this last tool that I've mentioned, we make that public. It's running so that you can actually check how it works on some of our data, and you can also upload your own data to see how what we think about interactions happening in some of your team dynamics. We also, importantly, include ethical considerations in many of these, in all of these papers. The prospect of hiding people's identity in a work context is potentially really dangerous. And so we think it's very important to be thoughtful about the application of these kinds of methods. And we specifically suggest not doing this without ensuring that everybody knows what's going on. And similarly, we incorporate some mechanisms into our prediction tool to ensure that people aren't sort of singled out by the interaction by the predictive algorithms. And the way we do that is, for example, we make sure that you have enough data to have some level of strength in our prediction. And similarly, we make sure that there's enough dynamics between team members. So you couldn't just, for example, select one team member and then go to your manager and say, look, I have evidence that this team member is contributing to the failure of our team. So we're really concerned by the potential to misuse a system like this. And so we've tried to incorporate those things. But absolutely, this is a critical consideration for any kind of organization who would be applying these. Okay, so I'm sort of wrapping up, and I just want to step back and think about how this mechanism, this idea of resetting team dynamics, could actually be useful to study some other questions. So the first question, and one that we are sort of close to having results on, or close to having some publications on, is this question of, are groups or individuals more morally consistent? So essentially, if you ask people to make moral decisions, for example, like a jury, for example, where they think about a case and they need to decide whether or not the case should lean one way or the other, you would hope that groups are really consistent. Like that's what sort of democracy and the jury system is built on. It's this idea that we have some pure version of the moral truth. But you'd also hope that this kind of consistency would be, probably better than individuals. Otherwise, why would we do it? It turns out that it's a little tricky. We actually see that individuals and deliberative groups are basically the same, but both of these are quite a lot better than non-deliberating groups. So non-deliberating groups are basically not very consistent. And one way to think about this is if you voted in a context where you never talked to the people who are voting differently than you, you'd have a high likelihood of sort of not being representative of the underlying interests of the community or finding the sort of best resolution. But if you're more deliberative and talk through the issues, you're actually more likely to come to a balanced and reasoned outcome. And so, this might be a commentary on political decisions that we make in society today, and is absolutely a commentary on some of the more critical decisions made by organizations, for example, when deciding which kinds of media should be allowed to be shared on their platforms, as companies like Facebook and many others need to think about. And two other questions that we're still in processing data on or working on are, this question of, do the same people become leaders every time? So you can think about this as like, our status hierarchy is consistent. If somebody is elected a leader in a group at one point, is that person also going to be elected if we mask them and reset them? Our initial findings are that this is probably not, but still very early days for this experiment. And then another area that we think is really interesting is to understand whether people enact the sort of identities that they themselves have, whoever I as a participant have, or if I enact the identities of how people treat me. And we're able to study this by making these, resetting these team dynamics to have properties of identity that would be persistent. And so we could sort of see how the surfacing of those influences outcomes. And then, that's sort of where we're at with this. We've done a number of different experiments, and we're looking to do a number more. But we're really, really interested in how we can expand this to be sort of more representative of the broader spectrum of people's actual collaborations. As I said earlier, this is work with some incredible undergrads, as well as Michael Bernstein and Melissa Valentine. And we, of course, want to thank the workers of Amazon Mechanical Turk, with whom we worked with thousands to do this work, and our funders.
Well, thank you very much. A fantastic tour of a very, very exciting topic. And there's one person, Lisa Rose at least, that said that this is extremely timely as she's setting up creative collaborations right now.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that the distinction between deliberative and non-deliberative is also a very interesting conversation that people have always found important, and I think there's more topics there. There's certainly the whole citizen assemblies movement that people are saying deliberations critical to decision making. That's a whole
Absolutely.
very different topic, and I really think that this area of collaboration that you're depicting, again, what kind of relationships people have is a direction I would be fascinated to see explored. And yet it's obvious you did a lot of very careful, very thoughtful, and persistent work to accomplish this. So I'm opening it up, and I hope that there are questions from people. We've had about up to 30 people watching, and we expect that this will be on video as soon as we can get it up, and other people will get to see it too. Hopefully hundreds. Very exciting talk.
Okay.
Do we have any questions?
I don't see any at the moment, but I always believe in giving a little wait time.
Sure. And maybe Smitha or you have a question or thought, or maybe Steve.
I was wondering whether Lisa wanted to talk anymore.
Yeah, there's so does this work translate in any way to personal team dynamics is one question. And there's another one pending after that.
Could the person who asked that, I don't appear to be able to open the Q&A. I'm not sure why.
No, it's
could the person who,
it's all right. Just did this work would translate to personal team dynamics?
Yeah, I think I'm not entirely sure what personal team dynamics would indicate. It could mean a few
person.
things.
What they asked about was in person.
I'm sorry. In person. Yes. Okay. So we have actually conducted pilots with in-person teams, and we largely don't see differences, assuming that the manipulation is possible. Now, this manipulation is not easily possible because we have a hard time making people forget who they've worked with when they can identify their faces. However, the sort of underlying finding of making sure that you establish teams that have sort of good viability early on, this would definitely hold over. And in organizations where you have the opportunity to reset dynamics between people, that would still be just as valid. And I will say also that we have explored, but just in a very minor way, and this is sort of very nascent work, we have explored the idea of resetting dynamics within a team even though they can see each other. And you would think about this as perhaps putting people through some exercise that makes them think about their collaborators differently, and sort of erases their concerns from the earlier collaboration, and then see if that plays the same role. We haven't operationalized those studies yet, but that's definitely something that would be really interesting.
So,
Monica, I've asked you to speak for yourself. I hope you can.
Did you open it to her?
I did. I thought I did.
Monica's, your mic can be on if you want it.
I think I have it set so you can ask. Well, Monica's asked to talk about the features page again. To explain.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll go back to that page so we can talk through it a little bit. Yeah. So
she got confused about how to interpret the scales.
Okay.
I have to say I did too.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So what these are is we basically create 3 different models for these different predictive levels, and each column here is a different model, and each row is what the coefficient value and our predictive strength of that, or our certainty about that coefficient is for each of these features. So essentially, if it's if the coefficient, if the marker is on the right of the black line in each column, that means it's positively correlated, essentially, with this phenomenon. So for example, if we look at anxiety words, which is sort of a third, maybe halfway down, a little bit less than halfway down, you can see that it's very positively correlated with the highest viability teams, and it's slightly negatively correlated with these lower viability predictive accuracies. So that's sort of broadly what we're seeing here. One thing to note here is that some other ways of doing this, for example, using a deep learning approach or some other of the larger data analysis approaches that we could use, would actually make it quite a lot harder for us to know how specific factors are contributing to the success of a team. And so one of the interesting strengths.
So for the anxiety words, does that mean the highest percentile individuals are more likely to freely express themselves, unlike the above median and the above 10 percentile?
Yeah, so it means that when we're identifying if a team has been very successful, they're more likely, if we're making this above, above top in the top decile classification, the most far right one, it basically means that those groups are more likely to express themselves. However, if we're judging these lower splits of viability, it's less predictive. So essentially, it's saying, and it's not significant, but like the lean, that's why those are the red as opposed to blue. But essentially, it's saying that basically, if you express yourself too much and you're not doing well as a team, it's probably not going to help you. It's probably actually going to, maybe surface more frictions or something like this.
Oh, I see. So for example, for the variation in polarity scores, if there's a huge spread, how should we interpret that?
Yeah, so that basically means that it's not a useful predictor. It basically means that, you note that some of these are red, and the red ones are ones that cross the black line. That means that we can't actually distinguish the impact of that feature from no impact, right? So like we can't actually distinguish whether or not this feature is helping us very much. Essentially, so it may add like a little bit of improvement, but the improvement is mild.
So what's laconic mean then? The laconic one is sitting right on it and it's still green.
Yeah, so that means this is tricky because coefficients have hugely ranging levels of scale. So the laconic one is actually very, very small, but it is distinct from zero if we zoom in. And what that means is, people who don't use very many words, right? People who have very brief discussions, and that's mildly negatively correlated. So like, if all the collaborators only say very few things, then the team is going to be less successful in this regard. And just to note, this is kind of a weird scale because of that huge range in coefficient values. And so you'll see that down the bottom, it's called a SimLog scale, where basically it's a log scale that passes through zero successfully by essentially simulating log dynamic there. And one of the impacts of that is that things closer to this line are actually much more minor, right? These are incredibly minor influences. And then as things get further away, they're these much more substantial coefficient values. Critically, the coefficient value is not that important, but more the direction and whether or not it's a significant predictor is.
I was wondering, for the features, when you chose them, these specific sets of features, did you have to care about orthogonality, or was it just the most salient ones came up?
Yeah, so we did not explicitly try to make sure that they were perfectly orthogonal or something like this. What we really aimed to do is to cover the literature as sort of effectively and in a balanced way that we could. So we tried to collect like a large set of representative features from the human side, and then as many features as we could reasonably do given the sort of constraints that we had, and this was, you could calculate them in real time from the computational side. So it's more just like, let's see what we can get. And we had considered removing features that, for example, to achieve better orthogonality, but it turned out that it didn't make a whole lot of difference, especially in this style of analysis. So we don't report on that in any major way.
So we
Oh,
have
great.
another
Thank you so
question.
much.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
You mentioned that the use of algorithms in machine learning. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Just
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I mean, I think what this might be getting at is this idea that, if you had a lot of data, you could throw this at some deep learning algorithm or something like that, and you could probably get really predictive results. One of the challenges with using a mechanism like that is that it's a little bit harder to know why teams are being picked. What it is about the team that's making them succeed or fail, or be picked for one or a different viability category. And this is a problem because you could easily get in situations where you end up targeting features that you actually don't want to, and things that are atheoretical or things that might be some property of the individuals on the team are really easy to target. Example of this is if you trained on a group of teams that used a certain kind of English, and then you tested on teams that used a different kind of English. For example, they were part of a different global community where English is a second language. You may see really different results that aren't predictive. So one of the things that we really wanted to do here is like try to avoid any of these potential sources of bias. Of course, it's very hard to avoid them completely because our theory is built on these potential sources of bias. But we think that doing it with this approach and being explicit about the features that we're targeting helps us do that a little bit better. So that's sort of maybe one side of this question. Another thing that's interesting here is that this has sort of like several stages, right? There's how we judge the feature and then how we incorporate the feature into a prediction. And as it turns out, both of those can be done with these relatively simple mechanisms that don't rely on traditional or advanced machine learning, which we think is a sort of strength of our system.
Okay, there's another question which is about sentiment and how you measured it, and if you thought that maybe facial recognition would add to that if you had access to that, but to just give us the idea of how you measured it, how about that.
So all of our measures are off the shelf, libraries that measure these concepts. I actually don't remember the name of the sentiment library we use, but it's just a standard sentiment library. Actually, it's probably Empath. That's one that we use a lot in testing. So we probably used Empath, but I'm happy to check offline and get back to you if that's important. But yeah, what these tools do is they look at the use of words and they have judgments that have been made through a variety of techniques about whether a given word is considered positive or negative sentiment. And then some of the tools have like ways to determine mediating effects of other words. For example, if I said I'm happy versus I'm not happy, traditionally me using the word happy might be a positive thing, but if I use not before that, that sort of turns it into a negative thing. And that's how sentiment tends to be judged using these traditional techniques.
So, but Mark, you're saying these are all based on the chats, right? This is not for
That's correct.
voice.
Everything
no
we
voice
have
and no
is
face.
just, that's correct, that's correct.
Okay.
Everything we look at is just chat. Now, this question of these other data sources, I think the simple answer is absolutely. More signals may lead us to make better judgments. However, we will note two factors here. So in many cases, humans getting more signals don't get better at making these kinds of predictive decisions. And there's extensive work on how giving judges more data about the people that they're judging doesn't necessarily make them better at judging things correctly, and may in fact make them less good at judging, specifically because they glom onto external biases. Whereas if you give them a simpler data set that doesn't include those signals, you sometimes get better results. So I think that probably plays a role here, but I can't speak to it because we didn't test it at all. But it would be very interesting to look at how other signals play a role in predicting these kinds of outcomes.
Fascinating. Well, those are great answers to, I think, very, very helpful questions. Do we have any more before we start winding down, guys? I mean, I think that this, the question of how to think about collaborations where you are building a progressive relationship is partly dealt with in your idea of repeated rounds. And I was disturbed, of course, by the anonymity at first when you were talking about people not knowing that they were dealing with different people with the same names and kind of feeling faked out. And I was thinking, boy, if I was on the IRB, I wonder what I would think.
Yeah.
But indeed, that is a way to get to that mechanism, right? That the mechanism of continued, and that is speaks directly to the idea of continued relationships and progressive relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think there's 2 points there. On the one hand, I think the external validity of these kinds of mechanisms is really tricky to establish without doing it in a company or without doing it in a long-term, large-scale project. We haven't done that, and so I really can't make claims to it. That said, I do think that there's interesting indicators in what we have done that may align with some of those outcomes, and so that's sort of our hope, as is the case with any experiment. I will sort of clarify that I think how this kind of intervention or this kind of mechanism is surfaced to the participants, I think, is of critical importance. You definitely don't want to do this without telling workers that it's happening to them. That is probably a violation of some kind, but a legal violation of some kind. But even if it's not, it could definitely lead to lots of kinds of confusions that would be really problematic for these kinds of participants and even the organizations, the larger scale goals. So we always debrief our participants, of course, and that's how we were able to do this via the IRB. We register this as a deception study, but in the context of doing this in an organization, we would also suggest debriefing participants. It so happens that we may have an opportunity to run some of these experiments with some companies who are onboarding new hires. And we think that would be, maybe lead to some really interesting thoughts about how this works in the longer time scale. But yeah, we don't have claims to make about that.
Well, certainly research teams have relationships and make decisions, and even in deliberative democracy kinds of situations where you work with people over a period of a 2 or 3 sessions, there are gigantic issues around that. Focus groups, even in the first session, often have lots of framing issues and priming issues. Yep. I don't think that you have to necessarily go completely commercial. I want to
absolutely.
Yeah, I want to please just make sure that that as a speaker, you're going to receive a membership for a year to this hallowed organization.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, and I hope that you come to some of the other talks, and we certainly welcome your suggestions and thoughts or any participation you want to make to this organization. And I think Nancy, for example, is going to have a related topic coming up about Zoom. I don't know if that's if the next meeting has been set up yet, Nancy. Is that something that you are willing?
That's what we're aiming for, but we need to get a confirmation because our speaker's been traveling a lot lately. But as we see, anything is possible. Yeah. People don't have to be in our time zone.
If we and we definitely appreciate that you thought about it hard and figured out how to do it from Korea with no lag or problems with their internet, and we appreciate you taking care to give a great talk for us, and we look forward to hearing more from your research as it goes along.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a joy to speak with you all. And the Korean internet is very fast, so that is not a problem on this end.
It's supposed to be, and hopefully everyone's COVID responses will be fast too. All right. Well, with that, I think that everybody's gotten a chance to ask a lot of interesting questions. Mark, we appreciate it and let you get back to the rest of your life. And everybody this evening, thank you for coming to the program meeting. We'll see you again soon, I'm sure.
Second
Thanks so
Tuesday of the
much.
month.